Hello, in this video we will see TypeScript feature called classes. In a class you can have members, you can have properties, you can have inheritance, you can have interface implementation and so on. If you want to learn more about classes, go to the official documentation of TypeScript and inside the class page you will see all the configuration you can do with a class. I will use the playground feature of the TypeScript website where I will just put a simple message to get started with, like, welcome to the world of classes. And I want to check the output. So I will click on logs menu, click, and it's there. Okay, so let's get started with a class. Let's start a class called user service. And we define a simple member functions there, like say user count. A user count is of type number, and if I do not specify a value, I would get an error saying that this value has to be initialized. So either I can say equal to 0 to get rid of this error, or I can define a constructor with a this dot user count is equal to 0, or I could just go and mark it as a I will do initialization later, like this. But for the example of this video, I will go ahead and mark it as 0 as a default value. So this is how you can define a simple property or a field member of a class. Let's create object of this class using the syntax of new user service, and I will say console log user service dot user count switch soon and simple output 100. Nice. So this is our user count property. You can do one thing. What you can do is you can mark it as a read only, and when you mark a property as a read only, then you can either access it into a constructor. Sorry, you can only initialize it in a constructor or in declaration. You can access it anywhere. For example, if I add a function here, say add user, I will just keep it empty right now. And here, if I try to say user count is equal to 100, let me initialize initial value at 0. And I should get an error here that user count, you cannot update it because it is marked as a read only. Same should happen outside. If I try to say user service dot user count is equal to 200, I would get an error that this is a read only, you cannot set this value. So this is very handy keyword, read only, to protect the scope of your property. Okay, so that was read only and a simple field. We briefly touch on constructor. Like if I get this error, I can define a constructor. And in constructor, I can set value. This dot user count is equal to 100. Let me change value to get a different output. I will say 200 this time. Yeah. You can also do one thing. In TypeScript, if you do not define variable as a field member, you can directly say, let's say this time I would say public user count number, and here I will pass value user. I will not even set it. I will just say in constructor value, I will pass 500 here. And let me run this. Let me clean output first, and I will run this one. Okay, something interesting has happened here. Let's go through the code. We have a class. In this class, we have a constructor. In constructor, we have a parameter called user count with access specifier public. Next, we create an object of this class, passing the default value 500, and we are trying to hit the property. We are trying to read the property called user count. But if you notice, we do not have any field defined in user service called user count explicitly. It's because this syntax where you mark a property with a public specifier internally defines a property. So now if you go to this tab called d.ts, that is declaration of this definition of TypeScript, you can see after compilation, it explicitly declare a property for you, and then it accepts this as a parameter and set the value. So this is equivalent of doing public user count is number like this, and this dot user count is equal to user count. So now if I go back and I pass 1000 here this time, I will get 1000. So this whole code block can be written in a single line called public user count number. And this is very important because in many Angular application, you will see this kind of variable declaration, implicit variable declaration. Okay. Next, we can define some properties. I would like to have some kind of CRUD operation. So what I will do is I will define one interface first. Let me go and define one interface called user with ID, name, username properties. And now I will say users is an array of type user, and with default value is empty array. Okay, let me remove this one. And I don't want to pass any default value to the service. I do not have user count property. I want to provide a function called add user, which shall accept user as a parameter, and I will just add this into my users array. So push user. Okay, that means I need to create one empty object here. So I have this empty object, not empty object, it's a demo object, sorry. And here we have service dot add user, and I will just pass this demo object here. And I can just log user service dot users array to see the output. Let's clean the output first and run it. And you can see we got output of this function, not function, this users array. So this is the way you can add a function in a class. You can define the name of the function, you can pass parameters if there are any, and you can just do your business logic here. Interesting thing if you notice here is like these are all public, like user is public, add user is public. That's why you're able to call it. Is it a good object-oriented design? No, right? So we need to protect this user member. So what I will do is I will say this is a private property that can be used only within the class, but not from outside. So if I do that, as soon as I do it, I get an error like, hey, user is private and cannot be used outside. To get around this error, I have two options. One, I can define a simple function called getUser, and it will return user. It will return this users array, return this dot users. And instead of this, I would say get user function. Now, clean the output, run it, and we got array. However, is explicitly is in, is by default is public, but we will explicitly mark it for readability purpose that hey, this function is public, this function is also public. We mark this function as returns array, and here there is no we are not expecting to return anything, so it's better that you define this as a void. Okay, and you can see the declaration here, and you can see the converted JavaScript here as well. Let's go to the output. We got it. Okay. However, if you look at this, like we define this function only to return our member variable. If you work with C# or Java or any other programming language, they have this kind of getter and setter properties. Similarly, we can have here a getter property. So I can say public get users, and here I will return this dot users. That means I need to rename this private variable. Let's say I would say it's like underscore users, and I do not need this function anymore, so I will just remove it. I will get an error, so I will just take it out and I will say users without any parentheses. I can also specify parentheses. I can specify parentheses only if it is a function. When it is property getter, you don't have to specify it. So this is the getter property. Let's clean the output and run it again, and you will see the output here. Now, this is a getter property. So the next question is, can I have a setter property? Of course you can, right? You guessed it. So let's say public set users, and here, since it's a setter, you expect value, and value should be of type of this variable that you're writing. So now I would say this is the empty array, not empty array. This is user array, and this will be underscore user is equal to value. That means what I can do is I can say user service dot users is equal to empty array, and I will just try to run it again, and you get our empty array. So this is our well formatted class. We have a private field, we have a public getter, we have a public setter, we have a public method. We saw we had a constructor as well, so you can define a constructor, and you can move this code from here to this dot underscore is equal to this, just if you would like to. This is all about the class, basic class features and classes. We can go to the next one. Now, there is a public, there is a private public, and there is one more called protected. So what you can have is you can have a class base user, or you can just say base service. So we have a class here called base service, and I will define something here. Let's say uh, protected version of type string, and I will just set some default value here. And if I can say public get version of, and it shall return a string, I would say I should be able to say something like this dot version, right? But as you can see, I missed the return. As you can see, this version is defined into base service class, and I have a user service class which is not related. So you can have an inheritance called base service, And here, what will happen is this will be the base class and user server is a derived class. Now you will get error in constructor. When you have this kind of inheritance, your derived class must call a super, and the super will initialize your constructor of base class. That means first line of constructor should be super. If you do like this, it's wrong. It should be the first line. And as soon as you define this, let's say here, uh, base class version here, so that I can print it. As soon as you define this kind of inheritance in a way, you can able to access the protected version property inside the derived class. So now if I say console.log user service dot get version, I should be able to get the version from the base class. However, if you notice, if I try to, I will just do like this. If I try to access the version outside this class, I will get an error that this property is protected and only accessible within the class or a subclass. So this has to be used only in derived classes. So these are these access specifier you can have in TypeScript. Public, anyone can call it. Protected, only derived classes can call it, or the self class. Or the private, it can be used only within your class. You can have a read only, which can be initialized during initialization or in constructor only. We can have something called static. Let's say we want to have public, static, and let's define a property called user localization. And here I will say en. Okay. So now if I need to access this value, if I say user localization here, like let me copy it because it's a long variable name, I will get an error because this property is marked as a static, and this can be only accessed using class and not with a variable, your object variable. So if I need to access it, I have to copy the class name, put it here. So this is your class and your static member. And now if I just run the application again, I should get the default value here, en. So the static is used like this. And these are the public, these are the access space for static variables we can use like this.